So today we've got Nicola Hannafelt, who is going to be talking about her research on Alexander technique and women who are in the postpartum period. So we're going to dive in and start off. I just want to ask you a little bit about how the research was set up, the background to it. How did it come about? And I know a little bit about this.
Well, how it came about was a series of coincidences, starting at the 2015 Congress in Limerick, and I got introduced to somebody who was to become my future supervisor, which was you, as you know, and we linked up via Facebook, and yeah, nothing special. And then on the 1st of February 2017 on Facebook, you advertised this studentship at the University of Hull, and just in that moment I thought, I'm going to do that, and I applied and got accepted, and that's how I got into it. And it's been a very exciting time since 2017, since that day.
And you've now completed your doctorate, which is brilliant, so it's going to be lovely to hear about what you've done. And I suppose the first thing that I want to ask you about is that when we advertised it, it was to look at Alexander technique in women who were pregnant, and that's not where it ended up. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about what happened.
Yes, that was, I was quite happy with this idea of looking at pregnancy in the Alexander technique, and then I just had a chance encounter with somebody actually at Hull University. She was one of my landladies there, and she wanted to know what I'm studying, and she got into her own personal story about the postpartum, which was dramatic and very traumatic, although she'd had two intervention-free births. And something kind of shifted in my mind during this encounter. And I realized, because as a woman, I've also had 3 children, and I know I had good postpartum periods, although I was sometimes exhausted, of course, but I never had any issues. And I know lots of people have issues, back pain, all sorts of horrible things recovering from birth. And so we discussed it. I thought, could we not move this to the postpartum? And we discussed it in supervision with Julie, as professor of midwifery, and you, and it was just all around. Everybody thought that was a good idea. And the postpartum turns out to be very, very under-researched. So that was quite a good move, sensible thing to do, I think.
Absolutely. And you developed this idea of the working conditions of the postpartum. Can you say something about that, and then how that then kind of moved on?
Well, it was not my idea, the working conditions, Leslie. It was your idea, so I'm going to put that back to the originator. But it was a very good concept. And it means the kind of challenges that women have in the postpartum. You have, you don't sleep normally. You usually have to do childcare, baby care, infant care at night, and carrying a lot, you're feeding, you're sitting a lot. And that can produce tension issues. And so, you know, our ears pricked up that the Alexander technique can offer in this kind of situation, potential stress situations, and also not getting out and not being able to look after yourself, because I think the baby gets very put into the foreground in our society, and the working conditions of the postpartum with the issues she has to deal with when she's become a mother or had another baby.
And all of which seem to have, you know, Alexander has relevance to.
Absolutely, yeah.
It seemed like a really good fit.
Yeah.
So you went on to investigate. Can you say a bit about what you did?
We had 2 studies, and the first study I'll share a bit about today, and that was an interview study with women with prior experience of the Alexander technique. So that means there are 3 types of these women: and teachers, trainees, people in training, and clients or pupils, as you'd say. I live in Germany, so I call them clients. In England, they're still pupils. And these different amounts of previous experience, the question that I wanted to understand in this interview, this qualitative research, interview research, is how do women use the Alexander technique in the postpartum? And we interviewed, or I interviewed, originally it was 8 people with all these different sort of Alexander status. I don't know what's the plural of status. It's not statey, is it? But anyway, what is it? Statey? Doesn't matter. And then analyze these interviews to understand how these women were using the Alexander technique. And it was absolutely impressive with the amount of depth and how intricate they were using it in all different kinds of situations, and carrying and feeding, and in the relationship to their children, and looking after themselves. And the biggest finding was actually how, with what consistency they were using semi-supine for themselves on a daily basis.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the themes? That the semi-supine is interesting because that seemed to go all the way through to be a constant across everybody. What were the other elements?
Sleep and rest, and the rest is where semi-supine came in. Awareness and sensing embodiment, which of course anybody in the Alexander world, we're always, the Alexander technique only works via awareness, and these women were really eloquent on what they were aware about, and anchoring themselves in physical experiences to work on themselves and to avoid or work on tension issues. And then the third main superordinate theme that we identified was being an Alexander mum, and that was very much marked by a sense of agency.
And that was fascinating because it seemed to allow people permission in a way, or give people permission to take care of themselves. Yes. And self-care was a big part of that, I think.
Yes, and it's not, obviously I was into the academic literature, and it was a bit disconcerting to read somebody had reviewed papers on postpartum self-care, and taking rest only turned up once, and it was the partner making sure that the woman takes enough rest. Now, these Alexander mums, they were really into looking after themselves. There was sometimes it was difficult, or sometimes they were saying they had something like a maternal sense of duty, not connecting to their needs, but they were aware that that was happening.
And were able to make decisions, I think, if I remember rightly, about when they did put themselves first, and when they went, or how they went to their baby or did what was needed.
Yes, is this not reacting? Get myself organized first. The baby needs me, but I'm going to organize my pillows and let my neck be free and have a drink of water, and then I'm going to deal with your problem. It's not this jumping up to the babies. That's but they were also observing how other mums, I mean, they were all very aware that they were behaving quite differently. Not in a kind of arrogant way, but there was these words crunched and hunched over your babies, and scrunched up, and they were seeing other mums dealing with that and very aware that they had alternatives. So it was very, very heartwarming and touching and empowering to see how competent these women were.
That's really interesting. And did you learn anything about their relationship with Alexander technique, or Alexander technique, how they made sense of it?
Yes, there were the 3 themes that I just mentioned. There was actually a 4th main theme, and that was making sense of the Alexander technique. And it was pretty clear. I mean, for me, it was like a snapshot of how the Alexander technique is being applied at the moment in 2020, because that was last year when we did the interviews, when I did the interviews, a snapshot of women's thoughts, or people who are competent in applying the Alexander technique, how they were thinking about it. And nobody could say that's how it works. Lots of ideas how they think it would work. So obviously we have a lot of research to do still there. But I also found it very interesting that nobody was talking about the primary control, they were all talking about their head, neck, back relationship. So I think this, I mean, we have this muddle in the Alexander world anyway. What is the primary control and how important is it, and does it really even exist? And that kind of confirmed this suspicion that there's still a lack of clarity about the primary control. And they were talking a lot about directing, hardly anything about inhibition, but that seemed to be very implicit all the time, that they were only directing when they'd already inhibited. So at one point I'll get one point underlined, get round to writing that up for Stat or the Alexander Journal, but not yet.
And the inhibition, you kind of in a way touched on it before, didn't you? It's the inhibiting the desire to go and respond immediately to their baby. So there was inhibition there, certainly. And yeah, interesting. So what follows on from it? Where did this take you next?
I planned almost from the very beginning to write a book for the general public, for interested mums and people in the healthcare realm that might be interested in applying the Alexander technique in the postpartum, and it will be called Postpartum Handbook, Mindful Maternal Self-Care with the Alexander Technique. And I'm looking forward to doing that. At the moment I'm sorting out how to do crowdfunding, because I don't want to give it to a publishers. I'd like to do it myself, because I've had positive experience already of self-publishing. And the Alexander book publishers, both the ones we know, have expressed interest. I don't know what will happen there, but I know there is interest. And it's somehow much more fulfilling to self-publish than, because I have full control over what comes in there. So it will be a practical self-care handbook, but also linking up to little online input as well, because I think that makes it very lively. And the Alexander technique is not just reading, it's seeing something, trying something out. So I hope it will be very dynamic. So that's on the agenda. I've got to write a few more papers and submit to peer-reviewed journals, and what else? Yeah, and getting something like a course out there. So it's all, I mean, I only just finished, so it's all up in the air what's going to come now.
And part of it is that that's all based on, or partially based on, your second study, which I hope in another video we can hear more about, because you moved on from women who'd already had experience of the Alexander technique to a small-scale study looking at how women were able to use an online intervention online, because that was all that was possible during COVID. But that has some interesting outcomes. So hopefully we'll hear about that in another video.
Yes. Thanks, Leslie.
So thank you.